Good evening from Jerusalem. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you from all different parts of the world. A special welcome to Professor Amy Jill Levine, my co-author of this book. And many thanks to the National Library of Israel, especially to Doron Levine, I believe no relation to Amy Jill Levine, who is running this event behind the scenes, and to Olga Lempert, the project director for educational projects at the museum. Amy Jill Levine and I struggled a lot at different points when we wrote the book. And a lot of the struggles are really seen in the cover, both in the art of the cover, which we're going to come to in a couple of moments, and in thinking about what the title for this book should be. And oddly enough, I would really like to claim that the most important word in the title of this cover is, and the title of our book, is the word "and" in the Bible, with and without Jesus. And in fact, at one point when we were getting proofs back for the book, one of the editors accidentally changed the word "and" to "or," and we both had a fit, because this really is a book about "and" rather than "or." And one way of seeing this is looking at some of the comments that appeared on the website when the National Library advertised this. And here, for those of you who have never been there, this is the Jewish Studies reading room of the National Library. This is my favorite place to be when I study. This is usually where I sit. My sister usually sits right there, and we enjoy working together in a variety of ways. And in terms of comments, there really were three different types of comments, two of which we found problematic and really emphasized the importance of what we were trying to do in the book. One set of comments, and these are just taken from the website, the first and the second comment are really "or" comments coming from the Christian side, claiming that the only way that the Bible could be read, any part of the Bible can be read, is with Jesus hovering in the background. A second type of comment, coming, I believe, from a Jewish side, is that the only way in which anybody can read the Bible is without Jesus. Jews have read it that way for several thousand years, and that is the correct way in which the Bible must be read. A third type of comment, which really does represent what we are trying to do, is indeed this third comment here. And that's very much what Amy Jill Levine and I are trying to do in this book, namely to show both Jews what Christian readings are about and Christians what Jewish readings are about, to talk about more possibilities of readings and not to engage in any sort of polemics. And in so doing, we chose, with the help of our editors, this particular picture as our cover art. And indeed, some of the comments on the NLI website were quite surprised, like, what does this picture have to do with what we were talking about? And like, what are we doing as two Jewish authors? First of all, it's strange enough that we're talking about the New Testament at all, but why is it that we have a picture of an angel with a halo around it? But this picture perfectly represents what we are trying to talk about, because it is by a Jewish artist, very well known, Marc Chagall. The painting is called Abraham and the Three Angels. But as you'll see in a moment, a Jewish artist using various Christian tropes and themes in this particular painting. So here you see the three Anashim. Sometimes they're called, two of them are called Malachim, angels in the book of Genesis, visiting Abraham, who's over here, Sarah, who's over here. You have this nice little bubble in the upper right corner, which represents the angels coming to Abraham initially and telling him that Sarah is about to bear a child. And this particular image is very much copied from an image which is well known in art, and from an icon by the Russian Andrei Rublev, who was active in the beginning of the 15th century, called by two different names, the Hospitality of Abraham and the Trinity. Because within Christian tradition, the three angels are the three parts of the Trinity who come to visit Abraham and Sarah to announce the upcoming birth of a son, Isaac. And what Marc Chagall, who especially in the years immediately preceding the Second World War, and then through and beyond the Second World War, as a Jewish artist, appropriated these Christian traditions. And you see this especially in the White Crucifixion, a painting which some of you might know from the Art Institute in Chicago. And thus, our cover art really does represent the coming together in an and way of Jewish perspectives, Christian perspectives, not one at the expense of the other. In other words, not with an or in between them, but as we say in the title of the book, the Bible with and without Jesus.
Okay, so let's talk about how this got started. These attractive people you see in the picture, that's Pope Francis. This is St. Peter's Square, and Mark and I got to present to him in the spring of 2019 a copy of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, the two editions of which you can see on your screen. The first one came out in 2011, and then the much augmented version came out in 2017. And what the Jewish Annotated did, this was in part Mark's idea, because Mark had edited the Jewish Study Bible for Oxford, he along with Adele Berlin. And when they got done with that project, they thought, what next? Oh, let's do a Jewish Annotated New Testament. So what did this mean? It meant getting Jews together to talk about the New Testament canon and then the history around it. Like, what was the Second Temple like? Who were the Pharisees? How was Jewish law practiced? What was Jewish family life like? And we thought this would be a good volume because it might help Christians understand the broader Jewish context in which the New Testament takes place. I mean, the major characters are Jews, like Jesus or the various Marys, because they're all named Mary, or Peter or Paul. And it might help Jews understand that the New Testament is actually part of Jewish history. And in fact, the interpretation of the New Testament over time is part of Jewish history, because part of how that text gets interpreted impacts how Jews actually live. Are Jews being accused of killing Jesus for all times and all places? How do we understand those verses that might suggest that, and how have the churches understood them through the centuries? So Mark and I do these two volumes, and then we thought we still have more to do, because both of us I teach primarily divinity students, people who are candidates for ordained ministry in the church, which is a weird job for a Jew in the American South, but somebody's got to do it. And Mark teaches primarily undergraduates. But in all of our classes, we invariably wind up with Christian students saying to us, well, if you just read your Old Testament, and that's the term that they would use, if you just read your Old Testament correctly, you would see that it points to Jesus on every single page. And we thought maybe instead of explaining that we Jews have had our own interpretations of those same texts over the centuries, we could have a book that would explain it. And at the same time to say to some of our Jewish students, why is it that these Christians have stolen our texts? To say that what the New Testament does in appropriating some of that earlier material from the scriptures of Israel, generally from the Greek translation rather than from the Hebrew, and we'll see that they're actually reading the way people read in antiquity. If you put on a pair of Jewish lenses, you will not see Jesus in those pages. If you put on a pair of Christian lenses, you will see Jesus on every single page. So we thought writing the Bible with and without Jesus would be a sign, in fact, of mutual respect and designed to foster appreciation for the way people on the other side of the religious divide may, in fact, read these particular texts. Marc, do you want to add?
And also what we wanted to do, we loved working together for the Jewish Annotated New Testament, but that was an edited book. What this book, The Bible With and Without Jesus, allowed us to do was really to add our own voice to this particular issue for how Jews could understand the New Testament.
So here's what we did in the volume, and this is shameless self-promotion, but why not? We start out by explaining how the text has been interpreted. And there we give a sense of at least 3 different ways that one can look at a text. And here we're talking about what the church would call the Old Testament and what the synagogue would call the Tanakh. And sometimes we actually struggled on what to call that corpus of literature, because again, it depends upon the frame in which you see it. The text always has an historical meaning. So when Isaiah spoke, what were people in Isaiah's audience hearing? It has to mean something then. Because if you say to someone, oh, at some point, 700 years from now, some young woman will get pregnant and her son will be really important, most people don't care. 700 years from now is a little bit late. So it has to mean something in our own context. And then it has the Christian interpretation. And here, the passages that we took were the ones that in the New Testament, to use that Christian terminology, that in the New Testament are featured in a predominant, as Marc would put it, 30-point type or 50-point type. So they're major passages that get redeployed or recontextualized in the New Testament. And then we looked at how Jews have interpreted this, and heaven forbid that Jews would come up with only one interpretation. So when we look at how Jews understood the creation narrative or the Adam and Eve story, we find multiple interpretations, some of which are off on their own and some of which are deliberate responses to Christian interpretation, because it's not as if on Easter Sunday, Jews and Christians stopped talking with each other, or in fact, you had Christians over here and Jews over here, because again, all those first Jesus followers were also Jews. You are a priest forever comes from Psalm 110, an extremely important psalm in the New Testament and one of the most difficult Hebrew passages that we've got. It also depends upon some material in Genesis 14 about this mysterious priest king named Melchizedek, who in the Second Temple period was big. We talk about the misunderstandings of the eye for an eye and turn the other cheek. We talk about questions about blood, because I have had numerous students say to me, well, AJ, the epistle to the Hebrews, which they think that Jews are reading because it says to the Hebrews, and I have to point out it is in the New Testament, says you can't have salvation without blood. Well, in fact, in Jewish tradition, you can. We talk about what's come to be known as the Christmas story, the Greek translation of Isaiah, a virgin will conceive and bear a child, and you will call his name Emmanuel. We talk about Isaiah's suffering servant, which most Jews don't even know about, but is huge in the New Testament and in fact gets deployed in a variety of ways. We do the sign of Jonah, which for Jews, it's read on, the book of Jonah is read on Yom Kippur, and it is primarily about repentance. But in the New Testament, the sign of Jonah is primarily about resurrection from the dead. Jesus' comment from the Psalm, he says this in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, while he's on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And how do those lament psalms function? We look at Jesus' favorite self-identification. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. And we end each chapter and the volume itself by saying, here's the historical context. Here's how Jews have read this passage. Here's how Christians have read this passage. How might we today, in a gesture of civility and hospitality and friendship, figure out how Jews and Christians can read these shared scriptures together, and thus moving from polemic to possibility.
And thus, we're not only talking about different biblical passages in most cases, or different themes or different biblical books, but we're also fundamentally talking about different methods of interpretation. So AJ, a few moments ago, said, heaven forbid that Jews should agree on anything. And I represent this notion on this slide with just a randomly chosen Mikraot Gedolot, a rabbinic Bible, which has the biblical text here, its Aramaic translation here, and this particular one looks like it's 7 different commentaries. I guarantee you, without looking closely, 5 out of the 7 are disagreeing with one another, sometimes politely, sometimes less politely. And one basic characteristic of Jewish interpretation of the Tanakh is the tremendous variety of interpretive methods and of interpretations. And related to that is the fact that there is no center in Jewish interpretation. It is quite different from Christian interpretation, which AJ will talk about in a moment, where for most Christian interpretation, whether we're talking about, I'm using this term on purpose, an Old Testament text, or whether certainly we're talking about a New Testament text, everything has Jesus in the middle. Another characteristic of Jewish interpretation of the Tanakh is the extent to which it is amazingly diffuse.
Well, both texts are diffuse. I mean, we do have 4 separate gospels as opposed to one singular one. But when it comes to reading, and here we're using Richard Hayes, who was Mark's former colleague at Duke, so that's a shout out to Duke for both of us, the idea of reading backwards. So what Jesus and his early followers did in light of their own experiences is they went to the only scriptures that they had, the scriptures of Israel, some in the Christian tradition, some in the Hebrew, and some in the Greek, depending upon where they happen to be in the world. And they read their own experiences back into the text the same way that Rabbinic Judaism goes back into Genesis or goes back into Isaiah and reads their own experience. But here is this glory of multiple Jewish interpretation. The idea is, Devarach, give me another reading. The old saying that the Torah has 70 faces, Shiva Panim LaTorah, as if the text is this beautifully faceted gem, and every time you turn it, it hits the light in a different way, and you get to see another reading. So that's something that Jews can glory in. And there's a reason for that. In fact, there are several reasons. I think this is fabulous. We Jews are not held together primarily by confessional concerns or by the one correct reading, because we never settle down simply to be a religion in the sense of a belief community. And I know that's a very narrow definition of religion, but we don't have that much time. But Christians, when those Jesus movement communities were being held together, they were held together by belief. So belief was more important than this peoplehood thing, because they're held together by what becomes doctrine. And if you're held together by belief, you don't want to disagree too much, because if you disagree too much, then you find yourself in heresy. So in Judaism, a text can have multiple meanings. And at the end of the day, even if you have mutually exclusive readings, you're all still Jews. But if you're held together by belief, you want to control some of those readings, because you don't want to find yourself on the heretical model. So how does the church then understand the Old Testament? Whatever it is, it's somehow got to point to Jesus, and that controlled creedal interpretation.
So now we'd like to give you several examples of these ands, of this Jewish-Christian divide. We're going to start with perhaps one of the most famous ones, Isaiah chapter 7:14. Lachein yitain Adonai hu lachem ot, hine ha'alma hara, v'yoledet ben, v'karat shmo Immanuel. So I'll relate this Hebrew text to the New Jewish Publication Society translation, which follows the standard Hebrew text, what is called the Hebrew Masoretic text. Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign. And I'll just remind you that in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, there are signs of all kinds. Wearing phylacteries, wearing tefillin is a sign. A sign need not be something miraculous. But what is this particular sign? That an alma, translated here as a young woman, because that is what the Hebrew word alma means. It is simply a reference to a woman of marriageable age. And what is she? This word in Hebrew is an adjective. She is pregnant. She is with child. and what's going to happen because she is with child, and she's going to give birth to a son. This particular verb, violedet, a biblical Hebrew participle, does not have any particular tense in biblical Hebrew, but most frequently refers to something that is going to happen soon. And what's going to happen with this child? The karat shmo, and here the Hebrew text says, let her name him. I'll just mention that the Dead Sea Scroll version of this, which if you come and visit Israel, you could see a copy of it in the middle of the shrine of the book in the Israel Museum. Instead of the feminine vikarat, you have the masculine, vikarashmo. He will let him name him rather than let her name him. And the Hebrew has a two-word name, Immanuel, here. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Greek translation, which AJ is going to talk about in a second, these two words get conflated together to become a single name, Emmanuel. So in the Hebrew text, just to summarize, you have a sign. That sign is about a young woman who seems to have already conceived, is soon to give birth, and there's a command, as happens elsewhere, concerning what the child shall be named. Nothing especially miraculous appears in this particular Hebrew verse, which is contextualized in the reign of King Ahaz of Judah in the 8th pre-Christian century. Translations, however, do some quite interesting things with this verse.
Which is why it's so much fun. Even just in the term sign, the Greek term would be semia, so think semiotics, right? Sign, as Mark pointed out, can just be something perfectly normal, like see that basket of summer fruit over there. It says Amos's sign. But in the New Testament, the term sign, especially in the Gospel of John, gets used to refer technically to when Jesus changes water into wine at the wedding of Cana in John chapter 2, or when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, so he's dead, but Jesus raises him, and that's considered a sign. So in the New Testament, the idea of the sign can take on this miraculous, contrary to nature idea. The Greek translation is just talking about a sign here, but instead of describing that young woman as a neanias, which is what some later Jewish Greek translations read, it describes the virgin as a Parthenos. So we've given you the Parthenon in Greece and the Parthenon in Nashville, where I live. As they say in Nashville, our Parthenon is better because ours is newer and in better shape. Be that as it may. The Greek says, look, a virgin will conceive, literally will carry in her womb and will bear a son, and you shall name him Emmanuel. But even here, if we're talking about the virgin will conceive, that doesn't have to be seen as miraculous. What Isaiah is doing in the Greek is just giving the sign a little bit more time. In other words, see that young virgin over there. By the time she's graduated from college, gotten a degree, married, and has a decent bank account, God willing, then she will conceive and bear a child. So if you say, here's a virgin, and at some point she will become pregnant, that pregnancy need be no more or no less miraculous than any other pregnancy. So the Greek can be understood as some sort of miraculous something or other, or it can simply be understood as giving the sign a little bit more time to occur. But then we move to the New Testament. And here we are, we're in the Gospel of Matthew, the first of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew begins with the genealogy, really anchoring Jesus into Jewish interpretation, the son of Abraham, the son of David, the son of God. And then we run the genealogy from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob. And then at the end of that genealogy, we wind up with a fellow named Jacob who has a son named Joseph, which should ring some bells, because that second Joseph, who will be the husband of Mary, will actually dream dreams and go to Egypt. Joseph, this Davidic descendant, has a fiancée whose name is Mary. They basically agreed to the marriage, but they haven't come together yet as husband and wife. And Joseph finds out that his fiancée Mary is pregnant. So he decides he's just going to divorce her. He's going to do it quietly. They're not making a big stink about this, nothing about stoning. So he's resolved to divorce her. And then an angel appears to him in a dream. Well, of course, an angel appears to him in a dream. His name is Joseph, son of Jacob. What else? And he says to him in the dream, Joseph, son of David, here that Davidic connection, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you, and that's that question of who does the naming, you are to name him Jesus. It comes from the Hebrew root, from the same root as Joshua, or Hosea, or Hosanna, it's the root meaning save or salvation, for he will save his people from their sins. And then Matthew footnotes, and this is very, very common in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's one major way that quotes from the anterior scripture get reused in the New Testament. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. And Matthew drops in the Greek translation of Isaiah 7:14. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And here the shift, they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us, which is in fact what the term means. And Matthew, who is an excellent writer, frames the gospel by having Jesus in effect named God with us at the first chapter. And the very last line in the Gospel of Matthew is the resurrected Jesus saying to his followers, look, I am with you, Emmanuel, even to the end of the age. This is called a fulfillment citation, and it's one of the dominant ways that quote unquote Old Testament texts get used in the New.
So let's move backwards in the canon of the Hebrew Bible and move from a prophetic example to a very well-known legal example, where you have a certain interpretation of a text from the Tanakh in the New Testament, a text which appears in different variations in 3 different places in each of the major legal corpora of the Hebrew Bible, in Exodus, in Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And I'm just going to pick the best known 3 words from this phrase, ayin tachat ayin. Literally, and by the way, literally is such a problematic term, but literally, an eye for an eye. And before we get to the New Testament context, I'd just like to point something out. It is almost universal within rabbinic literature that this expression does not mean literally an eye for an eye, but refers to monetary compensation. In other words, if I take out the eye of somebody according to rabbinic law, I do not need to have my eye plucked out, but rather I need to pay that person the value of that eye. Medieval Jewish interpretation is uniform in understanding it that way. And I would even say that biblical scholars, most of whom are not Jewish, also agree that this does not necessarily mean literally the law of talion, lex talionis, a literal eye for an eye, but really the biblical text itself. The word tachat can refer to monetary compensation rather than to literal compensation in terms of bodily mutilation. So that is the biblical background of this in terms of the Tanakh. And now, AJ, take it away in the New Testament.
So my students are convinced that Jews are saying an eye for an eye is retributive justice. And Jesus does away with an eye for an eye as if all Jews are doing that. And then he decides this is not a good idea. And he talks about turning the other cheek. But the thing here is that, in fact, he's not talking about an eye for an eye at all. He's actually changing the subject. So he says, you have heard it said an eye for an eye. These are sometimes called antitheses. You have heard it said, but I say to you. We're in the Gospel of Matthew. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say to you, anybody who looks at a woman with the intent to do so is already guilty. They're not really antitheses. An antithesis would be, you have heard it said an eye for an eye, but I say to you, lock and load and take out anybody you can. That would be an antithesis. What he does is he changes the subject. There's a big difference between losing an eye or losing a limb and here, But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other. So if you presume a right-handed person, this is my right hand, and this should work on camera. If I strike you on your right cheek, so I can see Mark, so if I strike Mark on his right cheek, which is unlikely since he's in Jerusalem and I'm in Nashville, that's a backhanded slap. That's a slap of dismissal. It's the slap that a master would give to a slave or a Roman army officer to a peasant. It's like, get out of here. And Jesus is not here saying just be a doormat, but saying if somebody attempts to humiliate you, don't strike back, but don't lose your human dignity either, but stand up and say, treat me at least like an equal. He changes the subject. And on this as well, as Mark had mentioned, the issue of how do you interpret something literally and what does something literally mean? Christians throughout history have accused Jews of being much too literal. But we all have to determine, are we reading something as literal? Are we reading it as a legal principle? Are we reading it as hyperbole? Are we reading it as metaphor? Later on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will say, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your foot causes you to stumble, chop it off. And I think pretty much most people agree that he's being figurative here rather than literal. He understood the idea of an eye for an eye as also being figural rather than literal. It's a rhetorical device rather than a legal requirement.
So now let's move further back toward the very beginning of the Bible. And here, one very important difference between English translations that are Jewish and English translations that are Christian is that very often Christian translations put little hints, little chapter headings or sub-chapter headings in their Bibles, and you'll almost never see this in Jewish Bibles, whether in Hebrew or in English. Now, on the one hand, this is a great idea because it gives you a sense of what you're about to read, what its content is, what its theme is. But on the other hand, it gives the person who is writing these chapter headings and deciding what exactly these should be called a tremendous amount of power. So thus, if you were to pick up a typical Christian Bible and start reading Genesis chapters 2 and 3, the odds are very good that you're going to see the word original sin or the origin of sin somewhere in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. But I would just mention, first of all, that the words original sin are nowhere found in the text of Genesis 2 and 3 in the Tanakh, in the Jewish or Hebrew Bible. You to a small extent have it in one of Paul's epistles, in his epistle or letter to the Romans, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation of all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all, where the first man is Adam, the second is Jesus. This is called a typology. You have a type and an anti-type, an original and his opposite. But even this does not explicitly talk about original sin. That is an idea which starts to develop and become very strong, especially with the early church father Augustine, that you have it earlier as well, as a central Christian doctrinal notion. But I would point out that even though I'm saying that this becomes a central Christian notion, you do have some form of this in Psalm 51, verse 7, a psalm which, by the way, is much better known among Christians than Jews. Hen be'avon cholalti, uvechet yechematni imi. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. So I would point out, I'm going to try to say this very precisely, you have at least one biblical text which seems to have a notion which is similar to original sin, that each individual is born with sin. But, and this is going to be a double but, where each part is very, very important. In this psalm, this original sin is not connected to Jesus, And certainly in the original context of the Hebrew Bible, you do not have this notion of any sort of anti-type to Adam. So while I'm at the beginning of the book of Genesis, let me move one chapter closer to the beginning, to the very beginning, and then generalize to talk about texts which are interpreted differently in Judaism and Christianity. So for Jews, it is perfectly obvious that in the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, when God is speaking and says, Na'aseh Adam b'tzelmenu kidmutenu, let us make humankind on our image, after our likeness. I'm sorry, it should be in our image, after our likeness, that these plurals are our, the new and the new here in the Hebrew. In the original Hebrew context, this most likely refers to God talking to other heavenly beings. There are various biblical books, such as the first two chapters of the book of Job, which describe those heavenly beings. God has a type of cabinet with whom he consults. And that is the reference of the plural of our image and our likeness, while in Christian tradition, that same pronoun is typically understood as God speaking to other parts of the Trinity. Or another crucial text where there is such a dividing line between Judaism and Christianity, a text where here again, the lack of titles makes such a difference between Jewish and Christian Bibles. Open a Christian Old Testament, and toward the end of Isaiah 52 or the beginning of Isaiah 53, you're going to see the title, The Suffering Servant. Those words are not in the Hebrew. That is an interpretive move. And certainly, yes, there is somebody here who is called a servant. And as you can see from the bottom of this page, Vehu mecholal mipshainu, miduka me'avonotenu, musar shlomenu alav, ubachavurato nirpalanu. You can see the translation under, this guy is not faring very, very well. In Jewish tradition, number one, this verse and this whole chapter in which it appears is not terribly significant. For example, it does not appear in any of the Jewish traditions as a haftorah, as a prophetic reading. So AJ earlier introduced the notion of point of font size. Oh, in Jewish tradition, most Jews aren't even aware of the fact that this verse appears in the Bible. Maybe it's in 6 points. Maybe I'll even give it 8 or 9 points. Still relatively small. But these same verses, because of how they are interpreted, have a very different meaning already in the Gospels themselves.
Even if we can talk about a suffering servant, that's problematic because that requires lumping together different sections of Isaiah, presuming they're all speaking on exactly the same occasion to exactly the same person. So what happens in the broader Jewish tradition is we start finding multiple interpretations of who that servant is. The prophet himself, or Moses, or Hillel, it's all over the place. And eventually, because of the prominence of the Jewish interpreter, the medieval French interpreter Rashi, the idea develops that the suffering servant is the people Israel, brought into exile and thus wounded, and then brought back in a sort of like resurrected, but brought back to life in the homeland. And then the other nations are speaking and they say, look, that God of Israel must be so fabulous because these people taken into exile should have disappeared like all those other nations taken into exile. And the fact that they have been repatriated shows the power of the God of Israel. So the suffering servant is Israel. And the church comes in and says, wait a minute, this person who was wounded for our transgression, bruised for our iniquities, that has to be Jesus. And then the New Testament actually uses that verse in several different ways. So in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus performs healing miracles, as say the prophet Isaiah or the prophet Elijah or Elisha or Hanina ben Dosa, some rabbinic miracle workers do miracles and heal people. Well, that's the idea of healing. But we also find in texts like 1 Peter, another letter in the New Testament, the idea that Jesus is this suffering servant. And therefore, if you suffer in his name, you follow that same template. He is the suffering servant, and you suffer along with him.
A moment ago, AJ used the word repatriated, meaning returning to the land of Israel. And this brings us to another central difference between Jewish and Christian interpretation, a difference I'm very, very conscious of, because here I am sitting in Jerusalem. Promise texts of the land and descriptions of the land of Israel are very central to Jewish interpretation of the Bible. They're in 48 or 60 font size. Now, again, you're not going to find any Bible which prints them in all the different font sizes. This is sort of an imaginative exercise as a way of making you as listeners realize that the same Bible is sometimes different because different religious traditions print the very same text, sometimes even translated in the very same way in different sizes, so that for one tradition, it is very important, and for another tradition, it is much less important. So that the reading in Genesis 12:7, the first half of the verse, Vayera Adonai el Avram, Vayomer lizaracha eten et haaretz hazot. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will assign this land, Eretz, to your offspring, is of incredible importance within Jewish tradition, but it plays a very different role within Christian tradition.
It's in part how our texts are delivered to us, particularly if you get your sacred scripture through your religious organization. So if you go to church and you're a Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, mainline Protestant, you're on something called the lectionary, which is the parsha in the churches. And because Christians have a bigger Bible because they've got a part 2, they can't read that much of the Old Testament. So this promise to the land, which Jews will hear in the synagogue, because we read the Torah straight through, we'll hear it to Abraham, we'll hear it to Isaac, we'll hear it to Jacob, we'll hear it being alluded to in the Joseph story when he wants his bones to be brought back to the land. That promise keeps hammering over and over again. But in the church, you don't hear it quite that often. And also because of the way different texts get used, texts that are originally, and that's that historical context, originally about the land, come to mean something else. For example, here's Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah 31, extremely important in the church. This is the passage where Jeremiah speaks about a new covenant inscribed on the heart rather than on the body. So in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 2, following the birth of Jesus, which we saw from Isaiah 7:14, that use of the Greek, King Herod the Great, who plays the role of Pharaoh in Egypt in this text, so it's a kind of a replay of the early Exodus story. King Herod the Great has found out that there's been a newborn king of the Jews, and Herod's a tad put out by that because Herod thinks he's the king of the Jews. So he arranges to have all the children in the city of Bethlehem, because he knows that's where the baby is, all those children to be slaughtered. And this is called in Christian tradition, the slaughter of the innocents. Joseph, once again, is warned in a dream to flee from Bethlehem. So he takes Mary and the baby to Egypt. It's another Moses connection. And then the children are killed. And Matthew drops in yet again a fulfillment quotation. Thus was fulfilled what had been spoken, here citing Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah. This is where Rachel's tomb is, wailing in loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. For Jeremiah, historically speaking, this is following Babylon's invasion of Jerusalem. These are the captive Judeans being led out of the homeland and being taken into exile. to Babylon. But for Matthew, reading Jeremiah, these are the dead children in Bethlehem. So Jeremiah's concern for the land goes away. And if you read the next verse in Jeremiah, Jeremiah makes it very clear, and you can look at the Hebrew if you want, but just reading on in the English, thus says the Lord, stop crying. They shall return from the enemy's land. There's hope for your future. Your children shall return to their country. So when Jews read Jeremiah in context, getting to that next verse, they hear this sense of repatriation. And if Christians would use those fulfillment citations, whether from Isaiah or Jeremiah or any other part, and look to the verses before and especially to the verses after, it may well be that Christians hearing that comment in Matthew, Rachel weeping for her children, these dead children of Bethlehem because they are no more. In a Christian context, this idea of your children shall return, that can be read as a sign of resurrection.
Let me begin to bring this to a close by talking about three different endings of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. Most printed editions of the Hebrew Bible and some manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible end it in the Tanakh with Divrei Hayamim, with Chronicles, where the last few verses of 2 Chronicles have what is called the Cyrus Declaration, where Cyrus, the Persian king, according to the biblical tradition, this would fall in the year 538 before the Common Era, says, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Again, note how central the temple is in Judaism. And then he says, any one of you, of all of his people, the Lord his God be with him and let him go up. Note in this version, the final word of the Tanakh, Vaya'al, the word which is from the root Ayin Lamed Hey, Ayin Lamed Yud, which forms the noun Aliyah, meaning to emigrate to Israel. So in this reading, again, this goes back to Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. The Hebrew Bible is about the centrality of the land of Israel, returning to it even after exiled. But some of the most famous and best manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible do not end with Chronicles, but versions such as the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex end with the book Ezra Nehemiah. And that book, toward its end, has Nehemiah saying, Zochra li Elohai l'tova. Oh my God, remember it for my good. Well, just think for a second. Are you hearing any echoes in that particular line to other places in the Hebrew Bible? Surely some of you are hearing echoes to Genesis chapter 1, where everything that is created after almost every day is Vayar Elohim Ki Tov. God saw that it is good. And the word there used for God in Genesis chapter 1 is Elohim, exactly the same word that is used here, Elohai. So thus, in this construction of the Tanakh, the very end of the Tanakh in Nehemiah returns to the very beginning of the Tanakh in the creation story. Now, these two constructions of the first part of the Bible are very different than the construction, and here I'm using the word very much on purpose, of the Old Testament. And here, we don't know a whole lot about all of these different orders of the Bible in antiquity. And it is very likely that even though this order here, where Malachi, the last book of the 12 minor prophets, is the final book of the Old Testament, is the standard Christian order, but this probably was also a Jewish order that was picked up and chosen to be the order by the early Christian community. And here you see that this conclusion talks about the arrival of Eliyahu Hanavi, the prophet Elijah, before the awesome, fearful day of the Lord, Yom Adonai Hagadol V'Hanorah, and that this is going to be a time of tremendous cataclysm. Within the Christian community, where the Bible, as AJ said earlier, has two parts, an Old Testament and a New Testament, it makes perfect sense that this would be the order that is chosen, because then Malachi is a perfect segue into the New Testament, where John the Baptist in some traditions is understood as a new Elijah, and Jesus is understood as being the one who is going to facilitate the awesome, fearful day of the Lord. Thus, different orders in Judaism and Christianity, where each order makes sense within its own faith community.
It's in part because of those different orders that we so struggle with what to call this text. If we call it the Old Testament, then we're talking about the Christian canonical order. Both texts, Jewish and Christian, begin with Genesis, but do we end with Second Chronicles or do we end with Malachi? Because endings make a difference. So the Old Testament, we know we're talking about Christian Bible, part 1. Tanakh, we know we're talking about the complete Jewish Bible without a part 2, which is needed. And we were trying to come up with a metaphor for this. And Mark and I were both Americans. And this is provincial on our part, because I know that American football is American football and baseball really is our national sport, but this is the best we can do. So for those of you who have no familiarity with either of these things, our apologies. And we're open to new interpretations. But what is your canon? So we'll start with football. That's the one on the right. The canon of the church is football. It's linear, it's mono-directional. So you have, oh, this is the Duke field, how nice. So that you have the kickoff on one hand and it's negative yardage. You're in the opponent's side of the field up until the 50-yard line, which is Jesus. And you're heading toward that goal, which is the last book in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, sometimes called the Apocalypse of John, which describes what happens at the second coming. So it's linear. The Old Testament points to the New Testament, and the New Testament points to the second coming. Judaism is baseball. We go out into exile, and then we come home. We get to the end of the Torah, and we have Moses overlooking the land, wanting to get in. And then we rewind and we're back at Genesis and we get to the end of the canon and we have the Judeans in Babylonian exile and King Cyrus of Persia says, go make aliyah, go repatriate, and they go home. So to use the term game in a very serious way, the canons are different games with different structures, with different rules, with different orders, with different players, and with different interpretive histories. So the term Hebrew Bible is really not very helpful because it doesn't tell us what canonical order. It doesn't tell us what the interpretive history is. It's just a scholarly term designed to make everybody feel comfortable, when in fact, it actually doesn't make anybody feel comfortable. And one more point about the term Hebrew Bible. If you are Anglican or Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, your Old Testament has Greek material in it, like the books of the Maccabees. So in one of the weird ways that the world works, the Jews get the holiday of Hanukkah, the Christians get the books of the Maccabees, which to me is a fair trade. The Greek material like the wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, or Susanna, the world's first detective story, in addition to the book of Daniel, or the wonderful book of Judith. All that material is Jewish material written before Jesus was born. But the texts that are preserved in Greek, and they're preserved in the canons of some parts of the Christian church. So if we use the term Hebrew Bible, we're really talking about a Protestant text, rather than a Catholic, Anglican, or Orthodox text. And I want to be able to honor those other Christian traditions as well. So the terminology will always be a problem. But if you say Old Testament, you know you're talking about the Christian Bible. If you say Tanakh, you know you're talking about the Jewish Bible. And one more comment about that. When I was in graduate school, I was told by my professors not to use the term Old Testament because old was marginalizing and demeaning and ready to be remaindered or put up on the shelf. Well, I'm old, and old is fabulous. And in antiquity, the older you were, the more ancient you were, the more credibility you had. So what I'd like to do is reclaim the idea of old as fabulous.
And I would like to second that notion. And I'd like to say toda rabah. Thank you very much to all of you. We look forward to your questions in a few moments. And indeed, those of you who regularly come to the National Library, I very much look forward to the library opening again, to seeing some of you there. I'd like to thank the National Library of Israel for hosting this event, for hosting all of your wonderful events, and for being such a key institution for scholars and students of Jewish studies. So thank you all very much. And we now look forward to your questions.
Oh, look at all these people. That's fabulous.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. I'm also putting a link in the chat to your book on Amazon, as well as 3 other links. One to our website where you can see our future events and sign up to them and sign up to our newsletter as well. Also a link to donations to the National Library of Israel for whoever can and wants to, and also a link to a survey on our lectures. So thank you all. Regarding questions and comments. Sandy wrote a comment saying, "Act, why be so self-depreciating? Christians don't agree on much either, hence the various Christian denominations." And Rabbi Marx answered her, on the contrary, we are proud about our culture of disagreement. That's one set of remarks. Then Bob asked a question, what did you learn in your research about the character of God and the human response as shared by both the Tanakh and the New Testament? E.g., Jonah is about the character of God centered around Exodus 34:6.
Okay. Let me start with the first one. By the way, I do not have rabbinical ordination, so I'm Mark, I'm plain old Mark. But I would say I'm still going to stand by my particular comment. Of course, I recognize that there is all sorts of Christian denominationalism, but nevertheless, all Christian denominations are reading the entire Christian Bible as a Jesus-centered document. And what I'm saying is Jewish denominations, on the other hand, are not reading the Hebrew Bible with any one person or any one theme at its very center. And perhaps I didn't express that clearly enough, but whether or not you are seeing a central theme to the Bible is a dividing notion between how Christians tend to read the Bible and how Jews tend to read the Bible. Okay, AJ, do you want to take the second question or some part of the second question?
Obviously, we can't speak for all Christians, and nor would we. And the only Jews we can speak for are the two of us. Although sometimes Mark and I do finish each other's sentences. But there are dominant streams which one can locate. What I suggest to my students at Vanderbilt is it is perfectly okay for my Christian students. In fact, I encourage them to find Jesus in the pages of the anterior scriptures, what they would call the Old Testament. But I also ask them to look at Jewish interpretation of this same material. So in that sense, they get to double dip, which Jews generally do not do, because most of the Christian readings would be inappropriate in a synagogue, because most of the Christian interpretations, up until about 1970 or so, really had a Christological focus. And what's happened in liberal theological education, and this is about the same time when people started saying, don't use the term Old Testament because it's marginalizing and demeaning. Liberal theological education suggested that maybe Christians would do well to find out what the text meant in its own context. Excuse me, and that's a good idea too. So this idea of Jesus-centered readings, particularly in liberal Christianity, has broken down somewhat. And in that sense, the questioner has a good point.
And let me just say, I saw something in the chat box that I love and would like to acknowledge. That another image that we might use is an image of a chess or a checkers board. And indeed, the person I gather was British and called checkers draughts. But these are the same, these are played on the same board, but they're fundamentally different games. And I think that also is a wonderful analogy for what we're trying to do. So thank you very much for raising that in the chat.
I like that. What texts mean, it will vary depending upon who the interpreter is and that interpreter's location. One of the points that we make in the book and that we also make in our classes is if you read a text when you're 6 years old, and then you read a text again when you're 60, and it means exactly the same thing, something has probably gone wrong, and it hasn't gone wrong with the text. So those texts are always open to multiple interpretations. And a good way of doing this is to start by saying, what does this text mean to me right now? And then if you really want to be good at it, say, what does it mean to your neighbors? When grocery stores here were open and I felt safe going out, I'd be at Kroger's, which is this public grocery store, and I'd be in the checkout line. And this is in Nashville. And I can turn to somebody behind me and say, what do you think of the Sermon on the Mount? Because they will have an answer, right? But then you find out what other people in your own religious tradition have said and what they've said over time, because the way St. Augustine read the text is not the same way that Martin Luther read the text or Thomas Aquinas read the text. So there will always be some variations on the theme. And that's what keeps biblical studies interesting. Oh, and final note on this. When I gave this analogy, I was actually in England because I was on sabbatical in Cambridge. And I gave this analogy of American football and American baseball to one of my students. And one of my students looked up and said, yes, in biblical studies, it's sort of like cricket. You run back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and nothing really happens. So it could be whatever analogy you want. If it works for you, go explore it.
Thank you very much. Yes, I was going to read that comment as well. I found it very appropriate. There's a question by Howard. He started by saying that he's seen you quite a bit. I'm not going to read the whole text, but the question is, are there any cases where the traditional Jewish interpretation of the scripture is similar to the traditional Christian interpretation of the same text?
I'd call that neutral cases. I think that there are many such cases. The flood story is probably read in rather similar ways by both of those traditions. Many of the laws, the 10 Commandments, that I prefer calling the Decalogue, are understood similarly in both of the traditions. So you're actually raising a good question. I would love to begin to think about this statistically of in how many texts can we join in having the same interpretation versus how many texts within the Christian world are understood specifically about Jesus as more generally. I don't know the answer to that, but there certainly are many texts which the Jewish and the Christian communities, broadly speaking, would understand the same way. And I actually would point out, since AJ earlier in her comments talked about the great commentary of Rashi, that one of the wonderful things about the Middle Ages and the time that Rashi was writing is that at that particular point in France, the Jews and the Christians were talking to each other, and in some cases were even borrowing interpretations from one another.
Another way of looking at this is, and you can see the same thing in terms of political divisions, Jews reading on the more conservative side of things will tend to take things more historically as fact. And Jews reading on the liberal side will take things as metaphor or guiding story. Sometimes people will use the term myth. And you'll find the same thing in the Christian tradition. So you'll have more conservative Jews and more conservative Christians sometimes reading the same way, and liberals sometimes reading the same way. So how you understand biblical authority will also make a difference in terms of how you read.
Thank you very much. Doug asked, in reaction to early Christian understandings of Jesus' death, do you discuss the Akedah?
That's a wonderful question. We had so many passages that we wanted to look at. And this one has actually been looked at by a number of people. So there were quite good books already out on Jewish and Christian interpretation of the Akedah. I mean, Ed Kessler's book, for example, Shalom Spiegel's replay of that in The Last Trial. But the Akedah actually does not have a major position in the New Testament. So the New Testament itself provided us one of those guidelines to determine what text to look at and what text not to look at. We begin to see more of the Akedah getting used in patristic literature and then in rabbinic literature.
Yeah,
but yeah, that would be a great text to look at.
We could have written another 10 chapters. And if we did the Akedah, the Binding of Isaac probably would have been one of them. And now there's also another wonderful book on the Binding of Isaac by Aaron Kohler, who teaches at Yeshiva University. And again, it's really remarkable because so many Christians think that the Akedah is so prominent within the New Testament, and it really is not. And you have the possible allusion in Jesus carrying his own cross, which may allude back to what you have in Genesis chapter 22 of Isaac carrying the wood for the offering. But that even that is not a certain allusion.
Right. We're not sure why John has that, because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's basically the same story, but told three separate, with slight variants. There's a fellow named Simon of Cyrene who actually winds up carrying the crossbeam. So we have different versions of the crucifixion story here. Was John intending to make an allusion to the Akedah? It may be that John wanted to make it very clear that it was Jesus who was crucified and not Simon of Cyrene, because there were some other rumors that perhaps it wasn't Jesus himself on the cross. So here's the difficulty of determining the author's intent. We don't always know.
Thank you very, very much. There are many, many compliments and thanks in the chat. I will absolutely send you the transcript so that you can read, and also many, many questions that I won't be able to ask because of our time limit. And I apologize to those who I am not reading their questions. That said, Yehuda wrote, the Masoretic to Amei Mikra don't agree that the word hara is an adjective. The word alma is separated from the word hara by the disjunctive ta'am reviyah. Would you like to comment?
So I need to open my Bible. I mean, my question back would be, yeah. So in the Masoretic division, okay, so let me just give some background. The Hebrew Bible, as it was originally written, had no vowels and no punctuation. Beginning in the latter part of the first millennium, vowel points and cantillation marks were added, and the cantillation marks have several functions. One of them is indeed how the text should be chanted. Another is that they are a type of punctuation, and certainly the comment is correct, that according to the cantillation marks, you want to put the words, Hinei ha'alma, look, this young woman, and then the next three words belong together, hara v'yoledet ben, is in a state of conception, of pregnancy, and will give birth to a child. So hara grammatically still remains an adjective, but it belongs together with the following words, and will give birth to a child. And that makes perfect sense, because you become pregnant, and after that, you give birth to a child. So this whole phrase modifies young woman, but I think the general point that we're trying to make still does stand.
We do, in a number of cases, look at questions of cantillation marks. One other text that we could have talked about, we mentioned it in the book, is the use of Isaiah chapter 40, a voice crying, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord," which in the New Testament is the run-up to John the Baptist, who's out in the wilderness dipping people in the Jordan River and announcing the coming of the Messiah, Jesus, from John's perspective. And that's a question of, is it a voice crying, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord"? In other words, go out to the desert and build a highway, which is probably what Isaiah intended in chapter 40. Or is it, there's a voice crying, comma, quotation mark, and there's a voice crying in the wilderness, like there's a voice somewhere out there in the wilderness making noise. Can you read it like that? Well, for the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can read it like that. So the cantillation marks are one type of interpretation, but they may not be what the original author intended, and they're not the only way of interpreting the text, simply because, as Mark pointed out, they come in around the year 900 or so of the Common Era. One other thing that we were able to do was, for every text, if there were Jewish anterior or contemporary texts to the New Testament, we flagged them. What did the Dead Sea Scrolls say about this material, or Philo, or Josephus, or any of those other literatures written at the time, to figure out exactly how the New Testament was using the text, and then to look at how rabbinic and other forms of post-biblical Judaism were using it. And we find multiply diverse concerns. What the Masoretes do is attempt to control the tradition. We're looking at it before those controls come in.
Yeah, and the question is just so important because it did offer an opportunity to highlight something we didn't have a chance to say. That punctuation is really important. And sometimes there are significant differences between Jewish and Christian punctuation as reflected in the cantillation marks versus how the text is interpreted in the New Testament. And AJ is sick of this, but my favorite example of this is a t-shirt that I sometimes wear to class, but do not have with me, which describes the difference of where the comma belongs in the two phrases, "Let's eat, grandmother," as opposed to "let's eat, grandmother." So commas sometimes really are the difference between life and death.
Thank you very much. Again, my apologies to those questions that I need to skip over. One question is specifically to Professor Levine. Judy asked, do your students ever give up or set aside their overlay of Christianity enough to appreciate the Jewish interpretation or context of the Tanakh? Do you think or expect that this book can accomplish that among the general population that might read it?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I know it works at Vanderbilt, and here I actually run counter to some of my colleagues, particularly some now retired, who teach Old Testament, because what they would say to the students is, when you come into the Old Testament classroom, I want you to park Jesus at the door. And we're just going to look at what the text means in its original historical context. And when they come into my classroom, I said, bring Jesus with you. Why not? Because I'm not about to give up my own Jewish forms of interpretation to make everybody feel comfortable. And I don't think that you should, and Mark's tired of this metaphor, you should sacrifice the particulars of your own belief on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. I think Christians should be proudly Christians. And because I've given them that enfranchisement, then they can reciprocate. And this is just a form of hospitality. If I'm willing to grant you your type of reading, even though it doesn't work for me, I can see how it works for you. You might want to look at how the text has been read otherwise. And what they come to me is they say, I never realized the text was so interesting because it has now more than one focus. I never realized that there are different ways of looking at the same word, looking at the same context, understanding how history is important, but also how the literature is important. And the rabbis are great with literature. The word is used here, the word is used here. These letters mean this here, and they can mean the same thing here. So what the Jewish interpretation does for students in Old Testament is open up multiple possibilities. As long as they know they can bring Jesus with them, that's not the only message that they see. And I think that's a good form of hospitality. So yes, it does work. Will this book help? God willing, sure. At least it should. And in the long run, it should make things easier for me and for Mark when we get another letter saying, dear Professor Levine, dear Professor Brettler, if you had just read Isaiah properly, you would see. Now we can say, see chapter 3 or see chapter 4. And it makes our time more efficiently used.
Thank you very, very much. This will be the last question. Again, I apologize to all those I'm skipping over. Rabbi Dalia Marks asked, can you say a bit more about your motivation? To me, it seems a project aimed to tikkun olam, to make the world a better place.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Professor Marks. I appreciate that question, and I'll see you at a different lecture tomorrow night, which you are giving. That might be a little bit too strong, but this really, as we get older and older, as AJ mentioned, really is better, especially because if you're over 60 in Israel, you're already able to be vaccinated for corona. So as we get older, I think I have really become to realize that we can play a central role or try to play a central role in public discourse, which is something that I know you very much try to do within Israeli society. And especially, again, we've been working on this book for 4 years, but working on this book has really more or less been coterminous with Trump as president, where we have not only seen terrible anti-Semitism, including that horrific hoodie, which was shown on a person who burst into the Capitol a few days ago, but already from the beginning of the Trump presidency, a tremendous loss of civil discourse. And AJ and I'll let you speak for yourself, AJ. I'm a great believer in the power of civil discourse. But we were really writing in a time period where civil discourse was hardly being modeled at all. And I'm very much aware of the fact that Jewish-Christian relations have improved markedly over the last 40 years or so, 50 years or so. But I at least view this book as offering more opportunities for what talking to each other in a way might be. And thus, the conclusion of our book is called From Polemic to Possibility. And we really do want to raise, first of all, we want to discourage people from polemicizing with each other, but we really do believe it is crucial, even or especially if you're not going to agree with your neighbor, to listen to your neighbor, to understand where she or he is coming from, and to appreciate those different perspectives, even if you do not adopt it as your own perspective.
Just to add to that, and this goes back to the earlier question about Christian and multiple readings, to know that if you pick up a text of somebody's sacred scripture, that does not tell you what the person who holds that scripture sacred believes or holds that scripture authoritative believes, because all texts have to be interpreted, and they also have to mean something beyond what they meant for a believing or a faith community or somebody who wants to get the word of God, however you understand that. To be able to let Jews know that, if you pick up a Christian Bible and you read something, that doesn't tell you that the Episcopalian or the Catholic or the Presbyterian down the street takes that literally, that there's always this history of interpretation. To introduce Jews to the Christian Bible, because I think that's a form of neighborliness. Here in Nashville, I live in a predominantly Christian society. And I want, in the same way, I want my Christian neighbors to know something more about Judaism than the Shoah, something going on in the Middle East, and a tour production of Fiddler on the Roof. I want them to understand how I understand my Bible and what Jewish ethics are and what Jewish tradition is. I think we Jews can show that same type of hospitality to Christians, so that when Jews who live, and particularly if you live in a more Jewish bubble and you've never read the New Testament, to be able to say, this is also part of Jewish history, even though we don't agree on everything that it means. And it's a form of neighborliness to know what our neighbors are reading, particularly since the majority of our neighbors are reading that, and then to understand the different ways that those texts have been interpreted. So is that Tikkun Olam Gadol? I hope so.
Thank you all very, very, very much for being here. I'm going to open the microphones for those who I managed to get into the panelist room. I'm going to continue, so you can all open your microphones and say thanks personally. The microphones will now be open. Thank you, and we'll see you all in our next event.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you for running this so well.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank
Fabulous.
you.
Thank you.
Shavua Tov.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
hello.
Thank you.
Hi, Beth. How you doing? Ready for the seed?
Well,
Thank you.
Love it. Love
Hello.
Shakwa, really wonderful.
Hello, Beth.
Daraba.
Can you hear me?
Grazie.
דליה, מרצה מחר. דליה.
Thank you.
דליה, איפה את מרצה מחר?
Marc Brettler, are you living in Israel?
I am here for an extended Corona.
Okay.
Teaching at Zoom, teaching via Zoom. Yes.
Oh, very nice.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember us. I won't publicly say who we were, but we met you at a lecture. It's David and Martha Stern. You were at a lecture about 4 or so years ago on your book that you and Amy Jo Levine produced. And maybe you were
Yes.
So that's fine. I'm just glad to be anonymous, but it's nice
wonderful to see you again.
Very interesting. Yes, lovely, lovely lecture, and thank you. And perhaps we can meet sometime. It would be interesting. And I might invite you to be a friend on Facebook if I can then be able to be in contact, if that's okay. Thank you.
Pleasure. Or you could look up my email via Duke. I'm easy to find.
Yeah, now I think I'll get your book on Kindle or something, and I can enjoy reading it too. Your new book. Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Amy Jo Levine, you tell her who we are afterwards, okay?
Good to see you.
I've never met you, but you've met other of our friends. Like Mark Kinzer. You know Mark Kinzer, right?
I know Mark very well.
Right. But we've never met you in person either. So, but very, very, we do have your commentary that you did. We've enjoyed it too.
As everyone should.
Of course.
Hey, I hope post-COVID, AJ and I can do a roadshow together. That would be fun.
That would be great.
You should do it. Bring it to Canada.
Sure.
Oh, amen to Canada. Absolutely.
I eat up everything you guys write, so.
Thank you.
Right at the beginning, you showed a picture of a Mikraot Gedolot in one of, I think it was the first slide. Do you know who the publisher was of that Mikraot Gedolot?
It was a more modern Mikraot Gedolot. Nothing of particular distinction about it.
So I asked because my grandfather was Shmuel Schulzinger from the Schulzinger Publishing House.
Of course I know the name. It might very well be a Schulzinger or a photo offset of a Schulzinger.
Oh, Michael Schiffman.
Sure.
I didn't.
Was that Michael Schiffman I saw listening?
Of course it is.
It's Michael with his cigar, as it should be. Hi, Michael.
Nice.
Oh, fun. Mark, it's so nice to study with you again. Jennifer Klickfeld-Novick, you were my UHAM professor at Brandeis a while ago, and it's fantastic to hear you teach again. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. It's so good to see you. I indeed do remember you.
Mark, are you teaching online? This is Naomi Grace. Are you teaching a course online at all while you're in Israel?
Yeah, I'm teaching my 2 courses online, yes.
At a reasonable time for Israelis?
You could, my email, you can email me.
Okay.
anyway, I don't know how long it's going to go on, but I finally figured out how to at least mute it on my computer as opposed to on the site.
Thank you all once more for being here. We'll see you in our next events. Thank you very much.
Greetings from Cologne, and Mark, I do hope that I will have the opportunity soon to sit behind you. I'm very much looking forward to that. And if both of you, do you read German, by the way?
Yes.
There is a new Frankfurt translation of a theologian and a guy in Greek studies. If you're interested in the link, I'll send you.
There's also, the Jewish Annotated New Testament is also coming out in a German edition. It should be out in May.
Oh, that's a good one, because a lot of my elderly people are not that good in reading English. That's good news. Thank you. Okay, so I'll send Mark the link to the
All the best, Jesper. Good seeing you.
תודה רבה, להתראות, כל טוב.
Bye-bye, בשמחה. Bye-bye.
Let's have a good year without Mr. T.
Thanks again, everybody. Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
Laila Tov. Thank you. Bye-bye.